wrong. My hands are on the wheel.
I'm not reaching for anything.
If you move wrong, you're going to get hurt. Do you understand me?
You stop. To follow your instructions, I have to put the car in park.
Window down first.
All right, quick pre-story talk before we jump in. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you like stories where people keep their head on straight, get proof, and force real accountability, hit like and subscribe. So this started while Derek House was already having a normal day. He'd just left Costco in Woodridge, Illinois. He had the usual stuff in the car, big paper towel pack, a couple grocery bags that slid when he turned, and the receipt still sitting near the cup holder because he hadn't even bothered to fold it yet. He was thinking about getting home, not about anything police-related. Then he noticed headlights coming up fast behind him. At first, he assumed it was just an aggressive driver. No marked squad car. No clear police look. Just a vehicle closing distance too quick. Derek did what most people do. He eased to the right a little, trying to let the car go around him. But instead of passing, the vehicle jumped in front of him. It didn't drift in smoothly either. It cut hard, then stopped at an angle. It was sudden enough that Derek had to brake fast. His groceries shifted. The car ended up pinned near the curb, with barely any room to pull off cleanly. And that's when he realized he wasn't being passed. He was being trapped. A door flew open on the unmarked car. A man got out wearing plain clothes but with a tactical vest. Derek didn't have time to read patches or anything like that, because the first thing he registered was the gun coming up toward him. Derek's body went hot and cold at the same time. He kept both hands on the steering wheel, because that felt like the safest default. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't reach for anything. He just froze in that careful way people freeze when they're trying not to look like they're freezing. The officer, Daniel Murray, started yelling instructions immediately. Derek could hear that stressed edge in his voice that tells you this isn't a calm traffic stop. Murray was demanding Derek put both hands out the window and keep them there. Derek looked at his window. It was up. As Derek started to move, another vehicle pulled in. Another officer, Zachary Harvey, jumped out. He came in fast, too, like he'd been told this was serious. Harvey pointed his gun as well. Now Derek had two guns aimed at him, and the commands were stacking up. Murray wanted the window down and hands out, slow. Harvey was focused on warning Derek that if he did anything wrong, he'd be shot. Not tased, not detained, shot. Derek's brain did the quick math people do in these moments. Don't argue, don't move fast, don't make it worse. He tried to explain calmly that he didn't have weapons and that he'd just come from Costco. He wasn't trying to debate them. He was trying to lower the temperature, trying to make them see a regular person. But it didn't change their posture. They were acting like they were certain he was the guy they were looking for. Derek started lowering the window like Murray wanted, but he hesitated for 1 second because he knew something important. To fully follow the commands, he'd need to shift the car into park. And shifting into park meant moving his right hand off the wheel. That's the kind of small movement that gets people hurt when officers are already keyed up. So Derek told them, carefully, that he had to put the car in park to do what they were asking. He basically asked for permission to make that movement without being treated like a threat. They kept telling him to go slow, keep his hands visible, and focus on them. Derek did it in steps. He made sure they could see his hands before and after each move. Window down, hands visible, hands. Then he moved to put the car in park. Then Murray ordered him out. Derek opened the door slowly and stepped out into the cold air near the curb. His legs felt stiff, like his body was bracing for impact. He kept his hands out and away from his body like they wanted. They didn't ask him questions first. They went straight to control. They grabbed him, turned him, and handcuffed him, tight enough that he felt the metal bite, not just rest. Then they patted him down quickly, checking pockets and waistband, like they expected something to be there. Derek kept telling them he didn't have weapons. He kept saying he was coming from Costco. He kept his voice even because he knew if his voice cracked, they'd call it agitation. Then they walked him to the back of a police car and put him inside. From Derek's seat, the street looked normal. Cars still passed. The sky looked the same. People were still living their day. But he was locked in the back, like a criminal, still not even being told what he supposedly did. And then, just as fast as it escalated, it changed. Murray checked something, radio traffic, plate info, whatever he was being fed, and his tone shifted. He said kind of to himself that he didn't think it was the right car. Then he said the plate didn't match. Wrong car, wrong person. You could feel the moment where their adrenaline had nowhere to go anymore, and now they had to deal with what they'd just done. They opened the door. They uncuffed him immediately. Murray told Derek they were taking the cuffs off because they thought he was someone else, and he wasn't. Derek didn't yell. He didn't swing the story into a speech. He said what mattered. They had threatened to shoot him when he hadn't done anything. Murray admitted the mistake and tried to smooth it over by offering his card like a card could balance out what just happened. Derek told him he'd lived there for years and his kids went to school there, meaning this wasn't some faceless stranger you could scare and send away. This was someone rooted in the same town the officers were supposed to protect. And Derek stood there after they let him go, trying to steady his breathing, looking at his own car like it had betrayed him, because a normal drive home had turned into guns pointed at his face over the wrong plate. When Derek finally got back in his car, his hands didn't feel normal on the steering wheel. That shaky, delayed reaction hit once the danger was over. His wrists hurt where the cuffs had been tight. He sat there for a few seconds before pulling off, just staring at the dash like he needed to reset his brain. He drove home slower than usual. Not because of traffic, because he kept replaying the same moments. The unmarked car cutting in, the guns, the threats, the way every move he made could have been taken the wrong way. When he got home, he didn't walk in like it was a normal Costco run. He walked in quiet and tense, still keyed up. The bulk stuff was still in the car, but he didn't even start unloading right away. He told his spouse what happened, and the first thing that came out wasn't anger. It was disbelief. Like he needed to say it out loud just to make it real. He got boxed in by an unmarked car, guns pointed at him, and then they admitted they had the wrong plate. His spouse looked at his wrists and told him to take pictures. Right now, before the marks faded. So Derek did. He took photos of the cuff marks. Then he took a photo of the Costco receipt sitting in the car, because it mattered that he really had just been shopping. He took a photo of the time on his phone. He wrote down the location as best as he could remember. He tried to remember the exact order of what happened and typed it into his notes while it was still fresh. He also looked at the business card the officer gave him. The "here's my card" thing didn't feel like help. It felt like a move to make the situation seem smaller than it was. Because Derek couldn't stop thinking about one detail. The officers only realized the mistake after they had guns on him, after they cuffed him, after they put him in a squad car, meaning the verification came last. And Derek knew how that sounded if you said it out loud. Wrong place, wrong car, wrong guy. So what's the big deal, right? Except he was the one who had to stand there with two guns aimed at him, trying to move his hands the correct way while being threatened. That night, he didn't sleep normally. He kept waking up, checking the front of the house, checking his phone, going over the moment where he told them he had to put the car in park. He kept thinking about how easily that could have been misread. Over the next couple days, Derek talked to a few people close to him. Not in a dramatic way. More like he needed outside confirmation that he wasn't overreacting. And the reaction he got was consistent. People were shocked. Then they got quiet. Then they started telling him the same thing. Report it. Document everything. Don't let them turn it into just a misunderstanding. Derek started making a timeline. Not emotional, just clean facts. He also started thinking about whether anyone else saw it. Traffic was passing. Other cars had slowed. If someone had a dash cam, that mattered. If a nearby business had cameras facing the road, that mattered. And then came the part Derek didn't want to do, but knew he had to. He started looking into legal options because he wasn't trying to get rich. He was trying to make sure it didn't get brushed off. He wanted it on record that this happened exactly the way it happened and that it wasn't okay. He contacted a civil rights attorney. When they talked, the attorney didn't hype him up. He didn't promise anything flashy. He asked basic questions, the way a serious person does when they're building a case. Where exactly did it happen? Did Derek get names? Did he get badge numbers? Did anyone say why they stopped him? Was there any injury? Did he take photos? Was there any video? How long was he detained? What was said about the wrong plate? Derek had more than most people because he wrote it down immediately. He had the names. He had the card. He had the marks. He had the receipt. He had the timeline. The attorney told him what Derek already felt in his gut. Officers making a mistake doesn't erase the harm, especially when the mistake involves guns and threats on an innocent person. That's when Derek decided to file in federal court. Not because he wanted attention, because he wanted accountability that didn't depend on the same system policing itself. Once the lawsuit was filed, the story didn't stay private. It started moving through the community. People shared it. Some people defended the police automatically. Others said the same thing Derek was saying. Wrong car shouldn't mean no consequences. And then the village put out a statement. It had the usual shape. They said they regretted the incident. They said they took it seriously. But they also said officers acted based on the information they had at the time. To Derek, that line wasn't comforting. It was the whole problem. Because the information at the time was wrong. And the way they handled it almost got him hurt. After Derek got released, he didn't just try to shake it off. At first, he handled it the way a normal person would. He told his family what happened, showed the marks on his wrists, and kept replaying the stop in his head. The biggest thing that stuck with him was how fast it went from normal life to guns pointed at him, then how fast they switched up when they realized they had the wrong car. Over the next days, Derek started doing the practical stuff. He wrote down everything he remembered while it was still clear. Where it happened, what the unmarked car did, what the officers looked like, the order of events, and how quickly they uncuffed him once they said the plate didn't match. He kept the officer's card. He kept his Costco receipt. He kept the photos. Then he talked to a lawyer because he didn't want it to turn into one of those situations where the department says, "We looked into it," and nothing changes. The lawyer explained that if he wanted real accountability, it had to go through a legal process where records and policies could be pulled and reviewed. So Derek filed a federal civil lawsuit, and once that happened, the situation stopped being private. People around town started hearing about it. Some people immediately sided with Derek and said it was clearly wrong. Others defended the officers and said they were doing their job based on what they believed at the time. Then the village put out a public statement. They said they regretted the incident and basically claimed officers acted on the information they had. Derek read it and felt like it was carefully written to sound sympathetic without actually taking responsibility for how extreme the stop was. And that's where Derek's mindset locked in. He wasn't going to let the story become an unfortunate mix-up when the mix-up involved guns, threats, and a stop that could have gone sideways in seconds. Once the village put out its statement, Derek and his lawyer focused on paperwork, not arguments. They started requesting records, what info officers relied on, how the plate was checked, what reports were written, and whether any video existed. The main issue stayed simple. Officers went all in with guns and cuffs, then admitted within about a minute they had the wrong car. Around town, people split. Some called it an honest mistake. Others said the level of force made it bigger than a mistake. Derek's goal stayed the same: make it official, documented, and answered, so it doesn't get brushed off. As the case kept moving, Derek started seeing the difference between a public statement and real accountability. The village could say they regretted it, but in the legal process, they still had to deal with what happened step by step. Why an unmarked car boxed him in, why guns came out immediately, and why he was threatened while trying to follow commands. Derek's lawyer kept narrowing it down to the key point. If they could figure out in about a minute that the plate didn't match, then the stop wasn't just bad luck. It was a decision to escalate before verifying. Derek kept quiet publicly and stayed consistent privately. Same timeline, same details, same message. Being innocent doesn't mean you're safe when procedures get sloppy. In the end, the case didn't turn Derek into a public figure or someone chasing attention. It turned him into a record that said, this stop happened. A record that said the officers were wrong. A record that showed how fast things escalated before anyone slowed down to verify basic information. That mattered more than any statement. The village could frame it as regret. The officers could say they acted on what they believed. But the paper trail told the real story. Guns and threats came first. Confirmation came later. For Derek, the biggest change wasn't money or headlines. It was knowing the incident didn't vanish. It didn't get buried. It sat there in writing, forcing the system to answer questions it usually avoids. And for anyone watching this, that's the point. Staying calm mattered. Documenting immediately mattered. Not letting it be minimized mattered. Because sometimes the difference between nothing happened and this never happens again is whether someone decides to push back the right way. If you've ever been in a situation where you felt powerless and didn't know what to do, let me know in the comments. And if you want more real stories like this, where everyday people hold their ground and force accountability, make sure you subscribe.
Step out of the vehicle. I'm going to take a look around. I've got a suspicious feeling.
No, I do not consent to a search. If you want inside the vehicle, you need a warrant.
So you're not cooperating?
Get a warrant if you have legal grounds.
Listen, I'm in charge here.
Watch your language.
I smell something. Don't make me go further with this.
All right, quick pre-story talk before we jump in. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part, if one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Now, before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from. Country, state, city. I read the comments, and if you like stories where power gets challenged the right way, calm, legal, and recorded, hit like and subscribe. Because this one is a masterclass in how fast routine can turn into, we need to review Bodycam. It started in the middle of a traffic stop that didn't feel like a traffic stop anymore. Deputy Kyle Absedil stood at the driver's window with that posture cops used when they wanted the moment to belong to them. He wasn't yelling yet, but his voice had already shifted into that performance tone. Casual words, sharp intention. He told the driver to step out and said he wanted to look around the vehicle because he had a suspicious feeling. Inside the car, the driver didn't move. Sheriff Marcus Wilson, new to town, new to the role, and not in uniform, sat steady behind the wheel with both hands visible. He didn't argue. He didn't insult. He didn't plead. He simply refused. From the outside, it probably looked like stubbornness. From the inside, it was something else. Discipline. Absedil pushed again, acting like the refusal was the problem instead of the request. He leaned closer, angling himself to look into the cabin, and made it clear he didn't plan to leave without getting what he wanted. He framed it like cooperation was the easy path and resistance was the hard one. The kind of logic that sounded reasonable, until you realized it only worked if the citizen forgot the Constitution existed. Wilson stayed calm and repeated the same boundary. No exit, no search, not without a warrant. That was the first crack in Absedil's patience. He tried a new approach, asking what the driver suggested he do, like this was a negotiation and not a legal standard. Then he hinted that he could get a warrant. Then he tried to compromise by asking the driver to step out while he went to get it, an offer that made no sense, unless the goal was never the warrant in the first place. Wilson didn't budge. He remained in the car, composed. That's when Absedile's tone hardened into something uglier. He made a remark that wasn't about safety anymore. It was about dominance. He let a disrespectful word slip, one that carried weight, history, and intention. And in that instant, the whole stop shifted from questionable to revealing. Wilson corrected him without raising his voice. He didn't let it slide, but he didn't take the bait either. He made it clear he wasn't going to trade insults, and he wasn't going to be bullied into surrendering rights just to make an officer feel in control. Absedile reacted like a man being denied what he was used to taking. He claimed he was in charge. He claimed the driver was making him angry. He claimed that if the driver had nothing to hide, there would be no problem letting him look. And then, like so many of these stops, he tried to rewrite the whole thing as a test, as if that word could magically replace legal grounds. Wilson held the line. He stayed polite. He stayed firm. He made it clear the test didn't matter. That's when Absedile went for the oldest trick in the book: manufactured suspicion. He said he smelled something. Then he implied it could be something extreme, something designed to make the driver panic, to make bystanders assume guilt, to give himself cover for a search that had no real basis. It was the kind of claim that couldn't easily be disproven in the moment. The kind of claim that sounded official enough to scare people into folding. But Wilson didn't fold. He didn't panic, and he didn't start over-explaining. He simply pointed out what was happening. The deputy was escalating because he'd been told no. And here's the part people miss when they watch clips like this online. This wasn't just about one deputy's attitude. This was about the quiet game that happens in thousands of stops. An officer searching for consent, because consent is easier than justification. A driver weighing fear against rights. And a badge relying on the fact that most people don't know what they can refuse. In this case, the driver knew. Wilson sat there in the dimming light, engine idling, phone mounted in plain view. He wasn't live streaming, not yet, but the setup told Absedile something important. This stop wasn't disappearing into the night. Absedile noticed it. His eyes flicked toward the windshield mount. He masked it fast, but the pressure shifted. Because there was a difference between harassing someone who felt alone and harassing someone who looked prepared to document everything. Still, Absedile tried one more push. He asked for access to the trunk, even though the vehicle design made it obvious there wasn't a traditional trunk to pop. It wasn't about the trunk. It was about submission. A forced yes. Wilson refused again. Same calm, same boundary. No search, no exit, not without a warrant. That should have been the end of it. But Absedile wasn't looking for a clean end. He was looking for a win. And that was exactly why the next moment mattered, because Wilson finally adjusted just enough for the deputy to see him clearly. Not aggressively, not dramatically. Just a small change in posture, the kind that said, "You've been talking at a shadow. Now you're going to look me in the face." And then Wilson asked a question that didn't sound like a threat, just a fact check. He asked if the deputy had heard about the new sheriff in town. Absedile's confidence hesitated for half a second. Because suddenly, this didn't feel like a random driver anymore. And that half-second pause, that was the first sign the whole power dynamic was about to snap. The pause didn't last long, but it was loud in its own way. Deputy Kyle Absedile had been operating off a familiar assumption. Lone driver, nighttime-ish lighting, a little intimidation, and he'd get either consent or chaos. Either way, he'd get control. But when Sheriff Marcus Wilson leaned forward, just enough for the deputy to actually take in his face, his age, and his calm, the deputy's whole posture shifted. Not softer, more careful. Because confidence like that didn't come from bluffing. Absedile still tried to keep his momentum, though. He made a half step back, like he was giving space, while still talking like the driver was the problem. He pressed the same idea again, that he needed to see inside the vehicle. That refusal meant the driver was not complying, that this could be done the easy way. Wilson stayed steady and repeated the same line he'd been repeating the entire stop. If the deputy wanted inside the vehicle, he needed a warrant. Until then, Wilson wasn't stepping out. That's when Absidile tried to salvage it with tone. He shifted from aggressive to performative casual, like he could laugh it off as routine. He hinted again about getting a warrant, as if the driver should feel nervous about that. Then he tried to slip back into the compromise trap, suggesting Wilson step out while he just took a look around in the meantime. Wilson didn't argue with him. He didn't debate the imaginary warrant timeline. He simply held the boundary and made it clear he wasn't going anywhere, and the deputy should do what he claimed he was going to do. And right there, without a direct quote, without a shout, Wilson forced the deputy into a corner that bad cops hate most. Either articulate a real legal reason or admit you're fishing. So Absidile did what fishing cops do. He reached for emotion and insinuation again, smell, suspicion, vague danger, anything that sounded like probable cause without having to prove it. He even tossed out something dramatic, the kind of statement meant to make a driver's heart stutter. It was reckless, and it wasn't subtle. Wilson didn't flinch. And that non-reaction is what made the deputy's behavior look even worse. Because when someone throws out extreme allegations, and the person they're accusing doesn't even blink, it tells you the accusations weren't based on anything real. It tells you they were being used as a weapon. In the background, cars passed. A couple of people at the gas station down the road watched the stop like they weren't sure if they should mind their business or start recording. One person did exactly what people do now. They lifted a phone, not obvious, just enough to capture the shape of the scene. And Absidile noticed that, too. He didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge it, but his shoulders tightened like he felt eyes on him. Then Wilson asked that question again, about the new sheriff. And this time, he didn't leave room for guessing. He identified himself. Just like that. The air changed. Absidile's face did that thing people do when their brain tries to rewind the last 2 minutes at high speed, trying to remember what they said, how they said it, whether it was captured, whether anyone heard it, whether it could be explained away. Then came the fastest shift of the entire stop. The deputy's authority tone collapsed into damage control. His posture straightened, not with confidence, but with panicked discipline. His voice softened. His words turned respectful. The same man who had been pushing for a fun way to drag someone out of a car suddenly acted like he'd never meant any of it. But Wilson didn't let him rewrite reality. He stayed calm and laid it out in plain terms. This deputy had walked up speculating, threatening, and trying to violate rights in his own jurisdiction, not because of a traffic violation, not because of an actual safety concern, because he felt entitled to turn a stop into a search. And then Wilson did something that separated him from the kind of leaders who make quiet excuses for bad behavior. He didn't make it personal. He made it professional. He made it about conduct, standards, and what happens when an officer thinks suspicion is a blank check. Absidile apologized again, quick, tight, eager. The kind of apology that didn't come from understanding. It came from realizing the wrong person had been targeted. And Wilson answered in the only way that actually matters in law enforcement: consequences. He made it clear that if the deputy kept pushing like that, if he kept treating citizens like suspects just to satisfy his ego, he could lose his badge. Not someday. Not hypothetically. Because the difference between a bad stop and a career-ending one is often a supervisor who refuses to look away. And Wilson was that supervisor now. Absidile tried to end it fast. He tried to retreat from the scene like it had never happened. He took a half step back from the window, hands moving toward his vest, like he wanted something to do with them. He stopped making requests, stopped making claims, stopped inventing reasons. He was done. Wilson didn't gloat. He didn't threaten louder. He didn't turn it into a public humiliation. He just held eye contact long enough for the deputy to understand one thing. The sheriff wasn't impressed by intimidation. The sheriff was documenting it. And when Wilson finally drove off, it wasn't a victory lap. It was a warning shot, quiet, legal, and unavoidable, because now there was a body cam timeline, a patrol log, a stop reason that would have to be written down, and a deputy who'd have to explain why his suspicion turned into insults, coercion, an imaginary probable cause the moment he didn't get immediate compliance. And that's where the real story began, because the stop ended on the roadside, but the accountability didn't. After the stop, Deputy Kyle Absedil went back to the station thinking about one thing: the body cam. He tried to act normal, but he was tense because he knew he'd pushed too hard. Sheriff Marcus Wilson didn't make a scene. He did it the official way. He flagged the stop, pulled the footage, pulled the report. Next morning, Wilson watched it. It showed Absedil doing the same thing again and again. Pressure for consent, then attitude, then threats, then that fake, "I smell something." The worst part wasn't even the search talk. Sheriff Marcus Wilson didn't turn the stop into a public lesson. He didn't call anyone out in front of the squad. He handled it the way a serious supervisor would, quietly, on paper, and on record. Later that shift, Deputy Kyle Absedil got told to step into a small office. Nothing dramatic, just a closed door and a seat across the desk. Wilson kept it simple. He told Absedil he'd watched the body cam, and he wanted one clear answer. What legal reason did Absedil have to push for a search? Absedil tried to explain it like cops sometimes do when they know they went too far. He leaned on vague wording, suspicious behavior, a bad feeling, something he thought he smelled. He framed it like he was being proactive. Wilson didn't argue with the deputy's emotions. He pointed out the problem. Feelings weren't legal grounds, and the footage showed pressure tactics, not a real investigation. The smell claim didn't match anything else in the stop, and the way Absedil escalated after being told no made it look even worse. Then Wilson made one thing very clear. This wasn't getting brushed off just because the driver turned out to be the sheriff. In fact, that part didn't matter. The driver could have been a teacher, a nurse, a teenager with their first car. The stop would have gone the same way, and that was the issue. That's when Absedil's confidence dropped. He stopped trying to sound in charge and started trying to protect himself. He asked if they could handle it informally. He apologized again. He tried to say he'd learned his lesson. Wilson didn't entertain that. He told him the review was moving forward. The footage was being tagged. The report was being checked. Supervisors were going to look at it, start to finish. And now Absedil had a problem he couldn't talk his way out of, because the story wasn't going to be whatever he said it was. The story was whatever the camera showed. By the next day, Absedil could feel it in the building. Not everyone knew the details, but they could tell something was being handled. Supervisors were quieter. People stopped talking when he walked into a room. That kind of shift always meant video existed. Absedil tried to get ahead of it anyway. He talked to a couple coworkers first. He framed it like a rough stop with an uncooperative driver. He made it sound like the guy was being slick, like the refusal itself was the suspicious part. He kept it vague on purpose because vague stories are easier to defend. But the problem was simple. The story wasn't his to control. The footage was. Sheriff Marcus Wilson didn't chase gossip. He moved the process forward. He asked for the report, the dispatch audio, and the full body cam from first contact to end. He also asked the shift sergeant for Absedil's recent stops to see if this was a one-time mistake or a pattern. Then Wilson did a roll call reminder, not a speech, not a new sheriff flex, just a short, clear message to the whole shift. He reminded them consent had to be real, not pressured. He reminded them bad feeling didn't equal legal grounds. He reminded them that if someone said no, that didn't give an officer permission to start inventing reasons. Most deputies nodded and moved on. A few looked uncomfortable. Absedil sat there stiff, trying to keep his face blank, because he knew exactly why that reminder was happening. Later, a supervisor pulled him aside and told him to write a detailed statement. Full timeline, reason for the stop, what he observed, what he claimed he smelled, why he escalated, why he used disrespectful language. Everything. That was where Absidiel started slipping. Because once you put things on paper, you can't hide behind tone. You can't blur facts. And if you claim you smelled something serious, people expect you to follow a certain routine. Call for backup. Call for a K9. Document specifics. Do something that matches that level of concern. His statement didn't line up with the video, and it didn't line up with normal practice. At the same time, the stop started spreading outside the station, not like a national viral clip yet, more like local talk. Someone had filmed a little from the gas station area. Someone else told a friend. People filled in gaps the way they always do. At first, the town mostly thought it was funny. Wrong guy, wrong day. Then people realized something else. If he did that to a calm older man in a nice car, he'd definitely done it to regular people who didn't feel safe saying no. That's when it stopped being funny. A couple community members called the station. Nothing wild. Just direct questions. What was the stop about? Was the deputy allowed to talk like that? Was the sheriff going to handle it? Wilson didn't argue with anyone. He didn't clap back online. He didn't fuel rumors. He gave the same simple response. It was under review, and the department would handle it properly. Inside the department, the decision point came fast. Wilson sat down with his command staff and reviewed the footage again. They didn't focus on the fact the driver was the sheriff. They focused on the conduct, the push for an illegal search, the escalation when he didn't get his way, the disrespect, and the made-up sounding justification after the refusal. That's what made it discipline-worthy. Absidiel got called in again. This time, he didn't walk in confident. He walked in careful. He tried one last save. He admitted he got frustrated. He said he shouldn't have said what he said. He tried to frame it like a bad moment, like stress, like a lesson learned. Wilson listened. Then he kept it plain. He explained that the issue wasn't just the language. The issue was the mindset. Absidiel treated a normal refusal like an offense. He treated rights like attitude. And he tried to scare compliance out of someone when he didn't have legal grounds. Wilson told him that couldn't be coached away if the person didn't believe the standard mattered. Then Wilson gave him the outcome. Absidiel wasn't getting a quiet slap on the wrist. He was getting formal discipline, the kind that goes in a file, the kind that changes how you're watched, depending on what the review found about past stops. It could also mean being removed from patrol or being removed from the department. Absidiel asked for another chance. He asked for probation. He asked to be moved instead of written up. Wilson didn't budge. He made it clear the department wasn't going to be the kind of place where someone only respects citizens when they might be important. The standard had to apply every time to everyone, on every stop. And that was the moment Absidiel finally understood the real shift in power. Not the roadside reveal. The policy shift. Because now the sheriff wasn't just a man who could stand his ground in a car. He was the boss who could make that behavior expensive. It didn't take long. A couple weeks later, Deputy Kyle Absidiel was pulled off patrol while they reviewed the stop. The body cam, the report, and his statement didn't match up. The pattern was clear: pressure for a search, then attitude, then made up reasons. The department let him go. Quietly. No big announcement. Just gone. Sheriff Marcus Wilson didn't celebrate. He followed it with real changes. Consent searches had to be clearly documented. Refusing consent wasn't suspicious. Body cam reviews became routine. Disrespect on stops became a discipline issue. After that, people noticed a difference. Stops felt less like a power game. Because the lesson wasn't, the sheriff won. The lesson was, rights don't depend on who's in the driver's seat. What would you have done in that car? Have you ever been pressured like that? Drop it in the comments share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more stories like this.
I've got complaints. I've got reasonable suspicion. Open the bag.
I do not consent to a search. What crime do you suspect me of?
Refusing makes you look suspicious.
I'm doing laundry. I'm not required to consent.
I can put you in cuffs. You want that?
Do not touch my property. That's
Then
essential.
open it, now.
All right, quick pre-story talk before we jump in. This was one of those situations that started off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realized how dangerous ridiculous could get when it was backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Because Officer Mason Reed had his hand hovering near his belt like he was preparing for a threat that didn't exist, while insisting it absolutely did. He stood over an older man who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved suddenly, hadn't done anything except refuse. Reed kept insisting he had complaints. He kept saying he had reasonable suspicion. He kept pushing for one thing, access. And when the older man calmly declined again, Reed switched tactics. He stopped pretending it was a request and started framing it like a choice between compliance and punishment. He made it clear he could put the man in cuffs. He made it clear he could take him downtown. He made it clear he could make the night messy on purpose. The older man didn't bargain. He didn't plead. He didn't perform fear. He simply held the line, politely, repeatedly, by invoking rights Reed was supposed to protect. And that raised one big question the entire time. If this was truly about safety, why was Reed acting like he needed permission to be angry? Now pause right here. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. City, state, country. And if you like stories where people stay calm under pressure, know their rights, and still force accountability without losing control, hit like and subscribe. Because this one is a textbook example of how power tries to win when it can't justify itself. All right, rewind. It started in a laundromat late at night, the kind of bright humming place that felt safe purely because it was lit up, not because it was protected. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Machines rumbled in steady cycles. The air smelled like detergent and warm cotton. A security camera sat high above the change machine, blinking like a quiet witness that never slept. Judge Franklin Carter didn't look like a judge that night. That detail mattered more than anyone in the room understood at first. He wore plain clothes, no robe, no suit, nothing that signaled status. He moved like an older man who'd done the same routine 1,000 times, slow, careful, and not in a hurry to impress anybody. He carried a heavy duffel bag because it was practical. Clothes were easier to move that way. His reason for being there was simple and modern. His washer at home had broken in the most annoying way possible, leaving him with wet clothes, a minor flood, and a schedule that didn't care. He had a courthouse morning ahead of him. He preferred order. He preferred being prepared. So he went where people go when life does what life does. He found the nearest 24-hour laundromat and handled it himself. No drama, no scene, just laundry. Officer Mason Reed, though, wasn't walking into the laundromat looking for normal. Reed had been on shift for hours, the kind of shift where boredom mixed with ego and turned into a need to find something. A call had come in earlier, thin details, vague language. A so-called concerned person had described a suspicious male with a large bag. No crime reported, no clear threat described. Just that familiar label that could be stretched to cover almost anything. Suspicious. Reed chose to respond like it was a gift. He pulled up, walked in, and immediately scanned the room the way some officers did when they wanted to establish dominance before they ever spoke. One patron kept their head down, trying to disappear into their phone. Carter didn't react at all because he didn't need to. That non-reaction bothered Reed. So Reed approached and tried to control the story from the start. He treated Carter like someone who needed to explain himself. He kept circling back to the duffel bag's weight, the way it sat beside him, the way Carter kept a hand near it. Not because he was hiding something, but because it was his property. Reed didn't present facts. He presented implications. He implied fear, He implied danger. He implied that the bag had to contain something that justified the way Reed wanted to act. He pushed for answers about what was inside. He floated the usual scary categories, things that made people surrender quickly when they didn't want problems. Carter didn't take the bait. He responded in a way that sounded almost boring because it was disciplined. He explained he was doing laundry. He kept his hands visible. He didn't argue about Reed's job. He didn't insult him. He didn't escalate. He just refused consent. And Reed, hearing a calm no, did what a lot of people in power did when they expected automatic obedience. He tried to turn the refusal itself into suspicion. He invoked reasonable suspicion, like it was a magic phrase that could erase the Fourth Amendment. He leaned into the idea that complaints were enough. He tried the pressure sequence, step by step, first casual, then annoyed, then threatening. Carter stayed steady, but he also did something important. He made the record clean. He kept repeating that he did not consent to a search. He made it clear he understood the difference between a lawful order and an intimidation tactic. He challenged the logic without challenging Reed's ego directly. He forced Reed to either justify the search properly or admit it was just muscle. And there were eyes everywhere. The laundromat's security camera silent and high. Reed's body camera, if it was on like it should have been. And a patron who had stopped pretending to scroll and had started paying attention the way people do when they sense something crossing a line. That's when Reed stopped trying to win with words. He moved to win with hands. He reached towards the duffel bag. Carter warned him not to touch his property, calmly, clearly, because that wasn't just rude. It was a seizure. Reed didn't stop. And Carter, still controlled, decided to do the safest thing possible in the most unsafe moment. He said he would open the bag himself, slowly, because Reed's posture and hovering hand signaled the kind of hair-trigger mindset that turned normal movements into threats. The room tightened. The air felt smaller. Even the machine sounded louder, because Reed was about to find out what was inside. And Carter was about to reveal something else Reed never saw coming. Carter opened the duffel bag slowly. He did it on purpose. Reed was too close, watching his hands like he expected a problem. Carter kept his movements small, no fast reaches, no surprises. The kind of careful that says, I'm not giving you an excuse. Inside were folded clothes, shirts, pants, socks, a towel, nothing else. Reed paused, just long enough for it to land. He'd walked in expecting to find something. Now he was standing over an older man with laundry in a bag. And the whole thing looked the way it really was. Bad. Reed tried to save it. He acted like the bag still proved something. He pushed the idea that Carter had been acting suspicious by holding it close. He made it sound like protecting your own property was a sign of guilt. Carter didn't argue. He didn't get loud. He kept it simple. He made it clear the bag was his. He didn't have to explain it, and he didn't have to consent to a search. That's when Reed's patience snapped. His voice tightened. His body language changed. The friendly act dropped. He started talking like Carter had forced this. Like refusing the search was the reason Reed was threatening cuffs. Like the officer's choices were Carter's fault. That was the real tell. Because if it was truly about safety, the clothes would have ended it. Instead, Reed was still trying to win. And the room wasn't private anymore. A security camera sat above the change machine, blinking. If Reed's body cam was on, it was rolling too. And a patron in the back had stopped pretending not to notice. Their attention was up. Their phone looked like it might be recording. Reed seemed to notice that shift. He tried to soften his tone. He started acting like he was ready to wrap it up. Like it had been a normal check. Carter let him talk. Then Carter asked Reed if he recognized him. Reed looked again. Really looked. Not like a cop scanning a suspicious person, like someone trying to place a face. His expression changed fast. Carter gave his name in a calm, flat way. No big reveal, no drama. Judge Franklin Carter. Reed's whole body language collapsed. His shoulders dropped. His hands opened. His voice went shaky. He started apologizing hard, like he could rewind the last 5 minutes with manners. Carter didn't let the apology erase anything. He laid it out clean. Reed had pushed a search with no warrant, used threats to pressure consent, and put hands on someone's property without legal grounds. Then Carter hit the point that mattered. Reed only cared once he realized who Carter was. That was the real problem. Not a mix-up, not a misunderstanding. The fact that Reed's behavior depended on status. Reed tried to bargain. He tried to back out and make it disappear. He kept apologizing. He kept asking in a roundabout way for Carter not to take it further. Carter told him that wasn't Reed's call. He said he would decide what belonged on the docket, and he warned Reed that the next time he needed a warrant or he needed to walk away. Reed left fast. He suddenly remembered how to de-escalate. After the door shut, the laundromat didn't feel normal again. Carter zipped the bag, went back to folding, and looked up once at the security camera, like he was making sure the record existed. Because the next day wasn't going to be a late-night power trip. It was going to be a courtroom. Carter didn't chase Reed outside. He didn't lecture him in the parking lot. He didn't do any of that. He stayed inside, finished folding, and handled it the same way he handled everything else, like it would end up on paper. Before he left, he looked up at the security camera again. Not dramatic, just practical. He needed to know the place had coverage. Then he walked over to the counter and asked who owned the laundromat and how footage requests were handled. The employee didn't ask many questions. They didn't need to. The older man's tone made it clear this wasn't gossip. Carter asked for the manager's contact. He asked how long video was stored. He asked them not to overwrite anything from that night. He didn't demand. He documented. Then he turned to the one patron who had been watching. He didn't ask them to take sides. He asked them for a name and number, in case someone later needed a witness statement. The patron hesitated, then gave it. People got nervous when police were involved, but they got more nervous when they realized the police could do that to anyone. Carter went home and wrote down the timeline while it was fresh. Times, location, what Reed did, what Reed threatened, what Reed touched, what cameras were present. He didn't write it like a speech. He wrote it like a record. Then he made 2 calls. One was to the court administrator's office to flag a potential conflict for the next morning. The other was to a contact at the department who handled complaints and evidence preservation requests. Carter didn't try to play detective. He requested that the body cam footage be preserved. He requested that any dispatch audio tied to the complaints call be preserved too, because he already knew how this worked. If nobody locked the evidence down early, it disappeared later. Not always on purpose. Sometimes just because systems were lazy. Either way, the result was the same. By the time Carter went to bed, he wasn't thinking about the duffel bag anymore. He was thinking about the part that bothered him most. Reed hadn't stopped because the bag was harmless. Reed stopped because Carter was important. That was the line that couldn't be ignored. The next morning, Carter went to the courthouse early. Same calm, same routine, but his staff noticed the difference right away. He wasn't rushed, but he was focused. He did the first thing judges did when something could compromise a case. He made sure it was handled on the record, not in the hallway. Officer Mason Reed had a court matter tied to the FOP. It wasn't the kind of thing that made headlines, more internal than public. The sort of issue where officers and their union fought about discipline, procedure, or a past incident. The kind of case where a judge's neutrality mattered a lot. And now Reed had personally stepped into Carter's life the night before. That wasn't something Carter could pretend away. When court started, Reed walked in looking like he hadn't slept. He wasn't acting tough now. He kept his eyes down. He stood stiff. His face had that tight look people got when they knew they'd messed up, but they were hoping nobody else knew. But Carter wasn't playing gotcha. He handled it clean. He disclosed that there had been an interaction the night before involving Reed and a possible rights violation. He stated that it created at least the appearance of a conflict. He said the matter would be reassigned to another judge to keep the process fair. That move hit like a hammer because it did two things at once. It removed any argument that Carter was retaliating through the FOP case, and it made it clear the laundromat incident wasn't going to vanish. Reed's side looked relieved for half a second, until they realized reassignment didn't mean forgiveness. It meant separation. Carter also stated that the incident itself was being referred through proper channels for review, not handled through courtroom attitude, not handled through whispers, through oversight. After that, it moved fast. Internal Affairs opened a file. Not because Carter was a judge, because the facts were ugly on their own. The dispatch record mattered. If Reed truly had complaints, there would be a log. There would be a call type. There would be a reporting party, or at least a timestamp. If the call was thin, that mattered too. Then the footage. Bodycam footage showed tone. It showed distance. It showed whether Reed threatened cuffs before he had legal grounds. It showed whether Reed used reasonable suspicion as a reason or as a cover. And the laundromat camera did something body cams sometimes didn't. It showed the whole room. It showed whether Carter had been calm. It showed whether Reed crowded him. It showed Reed reaching for the bag. It also showed the patron in the back. The human reaction. The moment the room realized this was going sideways. Within days, Reed's supervisors called him in. Union representation sat beside him. The normal script started. He was responding to a call. He was checking for safety. He was doing his job. But the problem with video was that it didn't care about scripts. And the problem with threats was that they sounded like threats no matter how you explained them later. Carter didn't do interviews. He didn't post about it. He didn't go looking for attention. He did what he'd always done in court. He let documentation speak. He filed a formal complaint. He included times, location, and a plain summary. He requested the evidence be preserved and reviewed. He also noted something that mattered a lot in these cases. Reed escalated after Carter refused consent. That detail was key, because consent was voluntary, and threats weren't voluntary. Reed's department put him on a short leash while the review ran. Depending on policy, it could mean modified duty. It could mean retraining. It could mean suspension. The point wasn't instant karma. The point was process. And Carter kept coming back to the same idea when people asked him privately why he pushed it. If Reed did that to an older man in a laundromat, he did it to people who had no title, no courthouse, and no staff to help preserve evidence. That was the real reason it mattered. The review moved faster than usual. And it wasn't because Carter was a judge. It was because the evidence was clear. Investigators pulled two things first: the dispatch record for the complaints and the video. If Reed really had a solid call, it would show up in the log with details. And if it was thin and vague, that showed too. Then they watched footage. The laundromat camera showed the whole room. Reed crowding Carter, reaching for the bag, and the way the place got quiet when the tone turned. Reed's body cam showed the order of events, how he pushed for a search, how Carter refused consent, and how Reed escalated after the refusal. That detail hurt Reed the most, because refusal isn't a crime. And it isn't reasonable suspicion. It's just a no. Reed's report tried to lean on phrases like officer safety and reasonable suspicion, but the video showed what actually happened. Pressure for consent, threats about cuffs and downtown, and hands on someone's property without legal grounds. So the department handled it through policy, not headlines, not drama. Reed got pulled off regular patrol while it was reviewed. Discipline followed, some mix of suspension, retraining, and a sustained finding depending on his record. If there were gaps in his body cam activation, that became part of it too. The union pushed back like unions do, but video made it hard to spin. And the ripple effect hit the precinct. Supervisors got stricter about body cams, consent searches, and stops based on vague complaints. Not because everyone suddenly changed, because everyone saw how exposed Reed got when a stop couldn't be justified on the record. A few weeks after the laundromat, Officer Mason Reed wasn't walking into places the same way. The discipline stuck, not as some dramatic downfall, but as a real mark inside the department. Supervisors watched him closer. Paperwork got checked harder. Any stop that relied on vague feelings became a risk he couldn't afford. He also lost something that mattered more than days off or training. He lost trust because the footage showed a pattern that didn't look like safety. It looked like pressure. And once that's on record, people remember. Judge Franklin Carter didn't go public with it. No interviews, no attention. He treated it like he treated cases. Document, preserve, follow process. But privately, he didn't let the main point get buried. Reed didn't change because the bag had laundry. Reed changed because the man with the bag had a title. That meant Reed's behavior wasn't about facts. It was about who he thought he could push. Carter pushed the system in the only way that actually lasts. He made sure evidence got preserved. He made sure the complaint stayed clean and specific. And he pushed for tighter expectations around consent, searches, and complaint calls that came in with no real details. The laundromat patron who watched that night ended up mattering too, not as a hero, just as a witness who helped keep the story honest when it could have been rewritten later. And that's the lesson that sat underneath everything. Rights don't protect you by themselves. Calm does, clarity does, records do. So, what would you have done in that laundromat? Would you have known how to refuse without escalating the situation? Tell me in the comments and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that no is allowed. And if you want more stories like this, realistic, modern, and focused on dignity and accountability, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
That patient matches my bolo. I'm taking him downtown. I don't need a warrant.
Lower your voice and step out. You have no legal basis to interfere with medical care.
You protecting your homeboy? You want to be treated like an
You
accessory?
don't have authority here without paperwork.
Step aside or you're getting obstruction.
I'm federal, and this patient is tired.
All right, quick pre-story talk before we jump in. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And here's the part that still sticks. It wasn't one big dramatic moment that decided how it ended. It was one tiny detail, one sentence, one piece of information that changed the entire power dynamic in real time. Because let me ask you this. What do you do when someone shows up acting like the rules don't apply to them, and everyone around you is too exhausted, too busy, or too intimidated to push back? What if you're the only person standing between official and out of control? Quick check-in. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you're into stories where intimidation fails the second it runs into somebody calm, prepared, and unmovable, hit like and subscribe. This one is a perfect example of how power bluffs and what happens when the bluff gets recorded. Now, here's where it actually happened. It was a hospital, late evening. The kind of place where the lights were always too bright and the hallways always sounded too quiet until they didn't. A treatment room door swung open hard enough to rattle the latch, and Officer Caleb Raines came in like he was responding to a crime in progress. He didn't come in with questions. He came in with conclusions. He announced that a John Doe patient inside matched his bolo. He insisted he didn't need a warrant to take the patient downtown. He spoke over the room like volume could substitute for paperwork. And right in the doorway line, blocking him without touching him, was Evan Cole. Evan looked like someone who had no business standing up. Fresh stitches, bandage pressure under his shirt, a hospital wristband half twisted on his arm. His posture was controlled, but the slow way he shifted his weight gave away the pain. Raines tried to treat that pain like leverage. Evan didn't give him any. Evan told Raines to lower his voice and leave the room, explaining that he had no legal basis to be there and no authority to interfere with medical care. Evan didn't say it like a challenge. He said it like a boundary. Rains responded like boundaries were disrespect. He accused Evan of protecting a homeboy. Not subtly, not accidentally. He implied Evan was part of the reason the patient was there. He warned Evan that he could be treated like an accessory. Then Rains threatened an obstruction arrest if Evan didn't step aside. That's how the chess game started. Not with facts, but with labels. He tried to make Evan defend his character instead of enforcing the rules. He tried to turn the room into a street stop where the loudest voice controlled the pace. Evan didn't defend himself. He didn't argue about insults. He stayed on process. Rains shifted tactics again. He demanded Evan's ID and said he would haul him downtown to run his entire background. He framed it like a consequence Evan had earned, not a legal step that required justification. In that moment, the threat wasn't really about ID. It was about humiliation, control, the message that a badge could turn inconvenience into punishment. Evan refused, not theatrically, not with anger, just a flat, steady refusal that forced Rains to do the one thing he hated most: slow down. A charge nurse stepped in next, Marisol Vega, experienced enough to recognize exactly what this was. She told Rains he couldn't enter a treatment room like that, and that if he had proper paperwork, it needed to go through administration. Rains dismissed her and kept pressing forward, repeating that the BOLO gave him full jurisdiction. A doctor reinforced it after that, telling him the patient was under active care and not cleared for anything Rains was demanding. The message was simple. Treatment came first. Rains treated treatment like an inconvenience. His focus stayed locked on one goal: access. And while he kept saying John Doe, he let something slip, something small but fatal to his own story. He admitted he actually knew the suspect's real identity. He tried to glide past it like it didn't matter. Like calling the patient John Doe was just a harmless label. But it mattered. Because if he knew who he was looking for, then John Doe wasn't uncertainty. It was a strategy, a way to force the situation without admitting he was targeting a specific person, without the legal steps that would normally be required. Evan caught it immediately and pointed out the contradiction, keeping it clinical and calm. Rains tried to shut that down by escalating again, repeating the BOLO line, leaning harder into authority theater. Evan shifted from holding the doorway to building a record. He instructed the nurse to call hospital security and hospital legal. Rains mocked it, because mockery is what people reach for when they feel the room slipping away. Then he made the mistake that hospitals never ignore. He moved closer, using physical presence to pressure compliance without saying it outright. Evan warned him not to touch him, and Evan reminded him that the hospital was covered in cameras, that hallways logged movement, and that staff documented incidents. The hospital wasn't a place where things disappeared into he said, she said. It was a place that produced timestamps. That tiny detail tightened the trap. Rains tried to reassert control by implying Evan wasn't in charge, and Evan didn't argue that point. Instead, Evan revealed the one thing that made Rains' entire approach instantly dangerous for him. Evan made it clear he was federal. And then he made it clear the John Doe patient was connected to an ongoing federal RICO case. The room didn't get louder after that. It got quiet in the specific way people go quiet when they realize a line has been crossed on camera. Evan told Rains that simply being in the room and attempting to take the patient was a jurisdictional violation, and Evan ordered him to leave immediately. Rains froze, recalculating, because the intimidation that had looked like authority when he walked in now looked like a career-ending mistake. Rains stood there for a beat too long, like his brain was trying to decide whether it had just heard a bluff or a name that could end his job. His posture changed first. The shoulders that had been squared for dominance loosened. The chin that had been tilted up dropped slightly. His eyes stopped scanning the room for leverage and started scanning it for exits. Cameras, staff, the hallway, the nurse station, anyone who might have heard the last 30 seconds. Evan didn't move aside. He didn't advance either. He stayed exactly where he was, steady, controlled, forcing the officer to do something rare, make a decision without momentum. So Rains tried to rebuild his authority in the only way he knew how, by reframing. He acted as if the federal angle was irrelevant. He tried to treat it like a misunderstanding that could be fixed by him simply insisting he was still in charge. He implied he could coordinate if Evan just stepped aside. But the room wasn't negotiating anymore. Nurse Vega had already started the documentation chain. Timestamps, names, a brief description of behavior, and the reason the hospital considered it an intrusion. Hospitals were built for records. A chart existed for everything. An incident report existed for anything out of pattern. This wasn't going to stay a hallway rumor. Dr. Shaw didn't debate the investigation. She made it purely medical. The patient wasn't cleared, and the officer was obstructing care by being there, raising his voice, and creating disruption. That framing mattered because it stripped away the officer's favorite cover story. He couldn't claim he was just doing his job when the job was actively interfering with treatment. Then the physical boundary arrived. Security lead Darnell Briggs came in with 2 officers, not rushing, not dramatic, just present. Hospital security didn't act like police. They didn't need to. Their authority came from policy, property, and documentation. Briggs positioned himself in the doorway line with Evan, slightly offset so the officer couldn't claim he was being blocked by a patient alone. That mattered too. It turned the scene from a personal confrontation into a procedural response. Rains tried to talk past security. He tried to keep the focus on the patient behind the curtain. He repeated the bolo point again, as if repeating it could retroactively make it valid. Briggs didn't argue. He requested the warrant, the supervisor contact, or a written directive. When Rains couldn't provide any of it, Briggs did what systems do when a bluff is exposed. He narrowed the options. The officer could step out voluntarily, or he could be escorted out and documented as refusing to comply with hospital policy in a treatment area. That second option would have been ugly, not physically, paperwork ugly. The kind of ugly that follows a person. Rains looked at Evan again, searching for the crack he'd missed, the angle he could exploit, the fear he could trigger. Evan gave him nothing. Evan kept it short and controlled, making it clear that Rains remaining in that room was no longer a disagreement. It was an interference issue. That's when Rains made the first move that looked like damage control. He backed up half a step and reached for his radio, but even that wasn't clean. It was the kind of radio use designed for theater, loud enough to signal power, vague enough to avoid accountability. He tried to phrase it like he was checking in, rather than admitting he had just been told to leave a room he had stormed into. Evan watched the officer's hands more than his face. Because in real life, the dangerous part isn't always what someone says. It's what they do when they realize they've lost control. Rains didn't get what he wanted on the radio. Either supervisor didn't answer fast enough or the answer wasn't what he expected. His face tightened as he listened. The performance started to crack. The officer who had entered the room like a storm now had to stand there and receive information like a subordinate. That was the second tiny detail that changed the outcome. Rains wasn't alone in his chain of command anymore. And the chain didn't like surprises. He lowered the radio and tried to salvage it verbally, implying that he could leave for now and return with proper authority. He framed it like a professional step, not a retreat. Briggs didn't care what he called it. Security escorted him out of the room and into the hallway. Once Rains was out, the room exhaled. It didn't turn into celebration. Hospitals don't celebrate. They stabilize and move on. Dr. Shaw returned to treatment. Nurse Vega checked vitals and updated the chart. A tech adjusted an IV line. The monitors kept beeping like they always had. But the emotional temperature had changed. Because everybody in that room understood what almost happened. A patient under care could have been pulled into the criminal justice system on a bolo and a loud voice, with no warrant, no clearance, and no respect for medical priority. And if Evan hadn't been the type of person who could say one sentence that forced a recalculation, that patient would have been gone. Evan sat back down carefully, as if his body finally remembered it had limits. His face stayed controlled, but the tension in his jaw didn't fully release. The pain wasn't just from the wound. It was from how close the system had come to doing what it often does when nobody pushes back. Outside the room, the consequences started moving almost immediately. A supervisor showed up within the hour, but not with the confidence Rains had walked in with. This was a different energy, measured, cautious, aware of optics. The supervisor spoke with hospital administration. He asked for the incident report. He asked for the camera coverage. He asked who exactly had been in the room. And that right there was the third tiny detail. Because in departments that care about liability, the question isn't always what happened. The question is what was recorded. Body camera footage existed. Hospital hallway cameras existed. Security logs existed. Nursing documentation existed. Names and times existed. Rains couldn't outrun that. By the next morning, the hospital's legal team had already packaged the complaint into something departments recognized, an allegation of improper access, interference with care, and threatening behavior towards staff and a patient. It didn't read like drama. It read like liability. And when liability shows up, the "we'll handle it internally" tone disappears fast. Meanwhile, Evan's side of the world moved differently, quieter but heavier. Evan didn't make loud calls in the hallway. He didn't announce federal names. He didn't need to. He communicated upward through the channels that mattered, and those channels treated what happened as more than a bad interaction. Because from a federal perspective, it wasn't just rudeness. It was potential interference. A local officer had attempted to seize an individual connected to a federal investigation in a protected environment, without coordination, and with threats directed at someone who told him to stop. So the response on the federal side wasn't emotional, it was procedural. The kind of procedure that shows up as letters, calls between offices, and careful language that sounds polite while it tightens the walls around the person who messed up. Rains felt it before he fully understood it. He got pulled off the street for administrative reasons. That phrase always sounded neutral until it happened to you. He was told to write a statement. He was told not to discuss the incident. He was told to surrender any relevant footage for review. And the worst part for him was that nobody acted like this was a misunderstanding. They acted like it was evidence. By the end of that day, Internal Affairs had opened a preliminary review. Not a friendly conversation, not a coaching moment. A review? Because when a hospital files a complaint, staff are witnesses. Security is a witness. Cameras are witnesses. Records are witnesses. And Evan was the one witness Rains couldn't intimidate. Rains sat in a small room later. No flashing lights, no sirens, no adrenaline. Just forms, policy language, and a supervisor across the table asking him to explain, step by step, why he thought a bolo gave him full jurisdiction inside a hospital room. And for the first time, he didn't have volume. He had to have answers. Internal Affairs didn't treat it like a personality conflict. They treated it like an exposure event. The first thing they did was lock down the timeline. When Rains arrived, who let him past the desk, which hallway cameras caught him moving toward the treatment wing, and how long he stayed inside the room after being told to leave by medical staff. Then they pulled the recordings. His body cam mattered, but it wasn't the only record. The hospital's security cameras showed the entrance angle, the hallway approach, the doorway traffic, and the moment security arrived. Nurse Vega's incident report read like a checklist. Raised voice in a treatment area, refusal to follow access protocol, pressure tactics toward staff, threats toward a patient, and repeated attempts to bypass medical clearance. And the part that made supervisors go quiet wasn't even the volume. It was the contradiction. On camera, Rains had leaned on the John Doe label, as if it gave him flexibility. But he also revealed he knew the suspect's real identity. That wasn't a slip you could wording your way out of. It meant he hadn't walked into that room confused. He walked in committed to forcing access without the steps that create accountability. That detail mattered for another reason, too. It shredded the department's usual defense. They couldn't claim he was acting under urgent uncertainty. The record showed he was acting under urgent impatience. The hospital's legal team didn't frame it like a dramatic complaint. They framed it like liability. They sent a formal notice that a sworn officer entered a restricted treatment space without proper authorization, attempted to remove a patient under active care without a warrant, and threatened staff and a patient when challenged. They attached camera stills, timestamps, and the names of witnesses willing to testify. That package landed on the department like a weight, because hospitals don't bluff. They document. Meanwhile, the federal side didn't yell either. They did something worse for Rains. They made it official. A federal supervisor contacted the department's command staff and made clear that the John Doe patient was tied to an active federal operation, and that the attempted removal created a real risk to an ongoing RICO case. The message wasn't emotional, it was procedural. It emphasized interagency boundaries and the consequences of interference. And that's when the entire situation stopped being a local embarrassment and became a command-level problem. Rains got pulled off patrol pending review. He sat through an interview where he tried to reframe his actions as proactive policing. He tried to make the bolo sound like permission. He tried to describe the threats as normal control of a scene. But the people across from him didn't need his story anymore. They had video. IA didn't have to guess tone. They could hear it. They didn't have to infer intent. They could watch him push past medical staff, push past policy, push past clear boundaries, and keep going until the room's power dynamic changed. And that change, Evan's quiet reveal, was the moment the officer's posture shifted on camera. It was visible. It was undeniable. Within weeks, the outcome wasn't subtle. Rains was formally disciplined for unauthorized entry into a restricted treatment area, conduct unbecoming, and failure to follow interagency and departmental procedures. He was suspended and reassigned, barred from solo response to certain calls, and ordered into retraining focused on constitutional policing and medical facility protocol. The department also did something it hadn't planned to do before the cameras existed. It revised policy. A written directive went out clarifying that BOLOs did not authorize warrantless entry into treatment rooms, that hospital staff retained control of patient access absent proper legal process, and that officers needed supervisor approval and coordination before attempting any removal from medical care. The hospital, for its part, tightened its own system. Not because staff had been wrong, but because they understood how quickly loud authority could try to turn policy into a suggestion. They added signage in the treatment wing. They updated the checklist at the security desk. They trained nurses on exactly what to say and exactly who to call when someone tried to muscle their way in. They built a faster path to legal counsel for law enforcement conflicts. And Evan went back to being what he had been before the door swung open, controlled, quiet, prepared. He didn't take victory laps. People like him couldn't afford to. He understood that being right didn't always make you safe. It just gave you a chance. The John Doe patient remained where he needed to be until he was properly cleared. The federal case moved forward without a local officer contaminating the timeline. And the hospital staff, especially Nurse Vega and Dr. Shaw, kept doing what they always did, showing up, holding the line, and documenting the truth. What this story showed, in the simplest terms, was that power loves confusion. It loves loud certainty. It loves people who don't know procedure well enough to challenge it. But the second someone stays calm, stays precise, and turns the moment into a record, the bluff collapses. So here's the question for you. If you were in that room, tired, stressed, just trying to do your job, would you have pushed back? Or would you have stepped aside and hoped it wasn't your problem? Drop your thoughts in the comments and share this with someone who needs the reminder that a badge is not a blank check. And if you want more stories like this, realistic, modern, and built around accountability, make sure you subscribe.